In the year 1949, there is a big fuss about a man called Bruno Gröning, who is known in the media as the miracle healer. It all starts in Herford, a small town in Westphalia. There are continual reports about new, unbelievable healings. Even people diagnosed as incurable swear by his healing power. Some call him a messiah, others a charlatan. When the medical profession takes a stand and regards this phenomenon with skepticism, Gröning is prohibited from healing in all of North Rhine-Westphalia. He returns to Bavaria to escape the chaos. Nevertheless, the media tracks him down again. In a short time, more than 30,000 people make the pilgrimage to the Traberhof in Rosenheim. And again, there are unbelievable healings. Gröning becomes the focal point of public interest.
They
came from New York, from everywhere. Once the Belgian colonial minister even came, you know. I can still remember it well. And people came there, rich Americans who even flew here from New York. They would offer you something, would lay a ring down on the table and say, "Here, I'll give you this, take me to Gröning now." But that wasn't right. That wasn't right at all. They would take out their car keys. "Here, the car's yours." At that time, that was damn tempting, you know. We couldn't even consider owning a car. We took a stance. I still recall how one woman reproached us bitterly. "I flew here all the way from New York," and so on. She was very rich. Then I said, "Well, look, what about that disabled veteran from East Germany? How long do you think it took him to get here? It's easier for you to come here again from New York than it is for the disabled veteran." I only want to document the basic attitude that we all had. We just couldn't start such a thing. It would have gotten out of hand. Sure, we could have lined our pockets. The possibility was definitely there.
Also die Möglichkeit war absolut vorhanden.
Wir hatten damals eben die Aufgabe über eine Rosenheimer Zeitung da am Traberhof.
At the time, we were given the task by a Rosenheim newspaper to report about Mr. Gröning at the Traberhof in a completely neutral manner and to simply observe what happened there. And at some point in the course of those 2 days, instructions suddenly came that we were to report somewhat more skeptically, even negatively.
Skeptischer, respektive sogar negativ zu berichten.
Of course, Gröning is also in the limelight at the Traberhof. The press representatives come in droves. He repeatedly faces the reporters' questions. However, the initially favorable reporting turns into a campaign of blatant character assassination. A journalist named Graf Soltikow, who strives to do a thorough report on Gröning, appears. He gives Gröning the choice of either a positive or a negative report. He had assembled ample material for both possibilities. He demands 50,000 marks from Gröning to refrain from writing a negative report. Gröning refuses. Soltikow carries out his threat. This is the way that the first great defamation took place in the media. The medical profession is aroused again. The Bavarian State Medical Association President, Senator Dr. Weiler, circulates a leaflet against Gröning. He writes, "Although I have had no opportunity to observe a healing by Mr. Gröning and am therefore dependent on the press reports, I nevertheless feel I can permit myself to judge the nature of the things happening there. During the last years of the First World War, I had the opportunity to carry out hundreds of similar apparent miracle healings. Doctors also cause healings from emotionally related disturbances in countless cases, but without generating a big fuss about it and putting the public in a state of alarm."
Wie die Ärzte dorthin gekommen sind auf den Balkon.
How did the doctors get up onto the balcony? I can't say. I only know that Gröning stood apart from the doctors and said to his people below that they would be helped, or something like that.
Hat denen eben gesagt, sie werden schon Hilfe kriegen oder so ähnlich. Und dann auf einmal hatte einer von den 6 Ärzten.
And then suddenly one of the 6 doctors had a microphone. No one else had a microphone, but he had a microphone, and he just walked up to the railing and called down to the people, "What do you want from this charlatan?" He went on to say outrageous things about Gröning and said that this kind of thing should be prohibited.
Gröning und sowas gehört verboten. Vielleicht haben sie auch gedacht, der siedelt sich jetzt hier an.
Maybe they thought he would settle here, and then the local doctors would lose their practices. I think that economic interests were behind it, even if they weren't mentioned. But I really think that was behind it.
Aber ich glaube schon, dass das auch dahinter stand.
Die Kleinen, die ihre Existenz fürchten mussten, dass so jemand geheilt wird, den er
The small ones, who had to worry about their existence, that someone they had treated for years in their practice for money would be healed. It's obvious that they had to hate him. That's how it all came about.
Ja, ist das geboren worden. Das Gros der Ärzte war natürlich nicht glücklich bei dem Gedanken, so kann man es auch.
Most of the doctors were naturally unhappy with the thought, you could say. Now there would be someone who simply looks at someone and says, "You're healed." Then they said, "He's either crazy or a liar." However, he was neither mad, nor did he lie.
Gesponnen noch gelogen. War sich seiner Sendung bewusst.
He was aware of his mission, and no one could take it from him. He demonstrated that it is possible to heal spiritually.
Geistig zu heilen. Das schließt alle anderen
This
Heilungsmöglichkeiten.
doesn't exclude other ways of healing. Homeopathy, acupuncture, and whatever other ways of healing there are today. They can all remain.
Heilungsmöglichkeiten. Die können alle bleiben. Aber
But Gröning always said, God is the healer.
Gott ist der Heiler.
The meanwhile completed cinema film is viciously attacked by the medical profession. It causes a virtual storm of protest. Various public health figures, including Dr. Weiler, feel obliged to take a stand. In justification of their opposition, they say that severe damage to health and public disturbances are to be feared. Dr. P. Lamprecht, in regard to similar events in Hereford, states, "It is not surprising that the medical profession is up in arms against a phenomenon. It has always been so. If Christ were here, they would forbid him to act just like 2,000 years ago. They would demand that he prove his qualifications as a healing practitioner. The physicians have all remained the same and haven't learned anything. It is only professional jealousy once again." Above all, Gröning is accused of mass suggestion. However, reports of remote healings provide evidence against that.
Forderte die Leute anwesend auch auf, an einen Angehörigen zu denken.
He encouraged the people present to think of a relative, if they didn't have any ailments or illnesses themselves. And that caused me to think of my father, who suffered from stomach ulcers since he was 18 years old. At this time, he was 49.
Immer Magengeschwüre hatte, bei jedem Essen, vor dem Essen, nach dem Essen, Medizin schlucken.
He had to take medicine at each meal, before and after the meal, in order to be able to exist at all, which naturally was a reason for me to think of him. And after about 2 days, I received a letter from my mother in which he described our father had come home from work. I don't know if it was at 3 in the afternoon or at 5 or 6 in the evening. I don't know the exact time, and had to throw up.
Und da musste sich übergeben. Es kam eine
A greenish-yellow liquid came up, and so my mother naturally blamed it on the gallbladder. What else, you know? That means that it happened on the same day that I was at the Traberhof.
Und von diesem Tage an
And from that day on, my father didn't have any more stomach ulcers. None. None at all.
Ich muss auch noch dazu sagen, glaubte genauso wenig wie ich.
I also have to say that he didn't believe in Gröning any more than I did. We don't kid ourselves about that. Nor did he believe afterwards that it was because of my being with Gröning. He didn't even accept it in retrospect. Naturally, he wasn't able to explain why it had happened. In any case, his stomach ulcers were gone. Therefore, he was able to eat everything and didn't need any more medicine. And as I was able to determine, my father turned, wait a minute, 86 years old. And he didn't have any up to the age of 86. He no longer had any kind of stomach ulcers. That was over with. He could eat and drink everything. It was only later that I was impressed by it all. As long as I was standing there, as long as he was speaking, nothing impressed me, to be entirely honest. It was only when I saw the effects on the people in wheelchairs, the blind boy, and then afterwards, a few days later, with my father, that I naturally had an entirely different opinion. That's normal, isn't it? Then you have to change your opinion. Beforehand, I don't want to put it that way. It was just something I watched. The facts are convincing, you know. I'm not very gullible, you see. First, I have to see something happen.
So schnell, glaube ich, ist es aber so. Ich muss zuerst so verschiedene sehen.
Also at the Traberhof, Gröning receives countless letters again. There is no end to the requests for help and healing. Katharina Gohr, for example, turns to him.
Und dann haben wir zu Hause einmal gesagt, mein Gott, wäre das nichts für meinen Onkel. Der Mann ist...
And then at home we said, wouldn't that be something for my uncle? The man had already suffered so terribly for several years from paranoia, which he had never had before, and which probably had its origins in his being buried in rubble during the First World War.
Es war so schlimm, wenn ein Flugzeug kommen hörte. Wenn die
It was so bad that when he heard a plane coming, when they came here from somewhere in Italy to bomb Munich or something, then he really flipped out. He would scream and rave. He boarded up the windows. He was afraid, deeply afraid. He locked himself in his room, became stranger and stranger, would hardly associate with people anymore. And when he did, he was very peculiar and sometimes also aggressive. And then he wouldn't go out at all anymore.
Teils. Und dann ging überhaupt nicht mehr weg. Und da haben wir uns gesagt, wenn wir im Jahre...
And so we said to ourselves, if not even a doctor was able to help him all these years, you know, we had called in a doctor for advice. He said, if he doesn't want to be treated, we can't do anything. We can't give him a shot, we can't do anything. So the case was closed. He was actually just a person that was gradually forgotten.
Wird allmählich, nicht? Wir durften ihm das
We put his food out for him. The door would open a crack, food in, closed again, for many years.
Jedenfalls habe ich mich aufgeschwungen und habe einen kleinen Brief an Herrn Gröning geschrieben.
In any case, I brought myself to write a short letter to Mr. Gröning and described it like that, maybe in no more words than I just used. I sincerely asked him if he would help this man.
Sich dieses Mannes annehmen könnte. Der Brief war weg und bei uns war nur Spannung im Hause. Wird man das beachten?
The letter was sent off, and the house was filled with suspense. Will they notice it? Will they even look at it when they get thousands of letters every week? And then one day, not long afterwards, I think it was about a week, a short answer came. Mr. Gröning has informed us that he will concern himself with your uncle and his case on such and such a date. Unfortunately, I can't remember the day. We were supposed to pay close attention to what happened at 6 p.m. on such and such a date. Please watch him, but don't do it openly, so as not to disturb the process.
Geschieht. Bitte beobachten Sie den Mann, aber machen Sie es nicht auffällig. Nicht, dass das gestört wird. Und wir haben das getan.
And that's what we did. At 5:30, we were already sitting there in suspense. My uncle had a small room upstairs, and suddenly we heard him open the door, which otherwise never happened during the day. And I'm talking about 3 or 5 minutes after 6. Can't say exactly anymore. I think that maybe Mr. Gröning had worked on him already beforehand, you see. My uncle couldn't have gotten dressed so quickly.
Herr Gröning sich vielleicht schon vorher mit ihm befasst hat. Wissen Sie, denn so schnell konnte mein Onkel sich ja gar nicht anziehen. Der war komplett...
He was completely dressed in a suit and hat, had his cane, and went down the stairs. Went to the front door, which he hadn't done for at least 4 years. I'm telling you, or maybe even longer.
Also, kann man sagen 4 Jahre, vielleicht länger, nicht mehr getan hatte. Ging zur Türe.
He went to the door. We had taken the precaution to unlock it. Went out, walked past our windows over there, and I still remember how my mother was desperately squeezing my hand because we were so tense.
So voller Spannung waren. Ich ging dann vorsichtig vors Haus auch, ihn zu beobachten, was tut. Und
then I cautiously went out to the front of the house to watch what he was doing, and then he took the path to a little bench, a small lookout bench with a beech tree, like a roof over it.
Wie ein Dach oben drüber hat so eine Buche. Und dort saß.
And he sat down there. That had been his favorite place before. When he was very tired in the evening, he used to say, "I'm going to Maurer's little bench." The property, you see, was part of a farm over there owned by a man named Maurer. So he was there, and then he came back. I ran back quickly and told that to my mother, and we both cried.
Beide geweint.
And I must also say that I understand today why we were so moved. When you see such a change, and really almost to the minute, I always say, that moves me even today.
Wenn die den dann gesehen haben, die Älteren, die sind.
When they, the older people, saw that, they all stopped and turned around. After all, they hadn't seen him for years, you know? Then they would say, "Well, my God, what's happened? There's Mr. Schweizernickel."
Und wenn sie ihn dann auf einmal sehen, ich sag ja,
and when the little children suddenly saw him, I tell you, they didn't know who he was. And they said, "Who's that? Who's that?" For us, it was like a miracle. And it was like that until his death. He was a kind, nice, and endearing person.
Ein liebenswerter Mensch.
Bruno Gröning also speaks to the people on the radio, and here too remote healings occur.
Ja, also ich war 11 oder 12 Jahre alt.
I was 11 or 12 years old, and we were 6 children. I was the second youngest of the 6 children.
Vorletzte von den 6 Kindern. Und
due to so many childbirths, my mama had terrible, severe hemorrhoids. She was always in such pain and had many problems.
Viel Schmerzen und sehr viele Beschwerden. Und die Ärzte haben das also nie in den Griff bekommen.
And the doctors could never get them under control with salve or suppositories. They never healed. There was relief, but they never healed. And Mama always complained of severe pain.
Und ich kann mich erinnern, wir hatten so ein ganz kleines Zimmerchen neben.
I can remember we had a tiny little room next to the kitchen. And I sat on the couch and read a book. And Mama sat at a tiny little table next to the People's radio set. My parents had a really old People's radio set.
So ein ganz alter Volksempfänger hatten meine Eltern. Und ich habe nur so mit dem halben Ohr gehört, dass ein Bruno Gröning.
And sort of half listening, I heard that some Bruno Gröning was speaking on the radio. And Mama listened very attentively, as if spellbound. And once I looked up and looked at Mama, I noticed that she was somehow tense and incredibly concentrated, and that she was listening very intently.
Und irrsinnig konzentriert und ja, intensiv zugehört hat. Und ganz bewusst.
And I can still remember the voice of Bruno Gröning saying something like, I don't remember exactly, "Come to me, everybody," or the like, "I'll help you." It was a sentence like that.
Irgend so ein Satz war das. Und ich weiß nicht warum.
And I don't know why, but I kept looking at Mama and she was very tense and suddenly her face was deathly pale.
Und sie sprang vom Tisch runter.
She got up from the table and my father came into the room and said, "What's wrong with you? What's wrong with you?" And Mama said, "I don't have any pain anymore. I don't have any pain anymore." I should add that here on this day, the pain was especially severe. And she said, "I don't have any more pain."
Und Mutti sagt, ich habe keine Schmerzen mehr. Ich habe keine Schmerzen mehr. Und der Vati war
And Papa was somehow, he had no idea what was going on. And I was also very, very surprised because I knew that Mama had been in great pain that same day.
War ihm sehr belastet durch diese Schmerzen. Und von dem Tag
and from that day on, her pain was gone. And she had a follow-up examination because she couldn't believe that she had been completely healed. And her doctor, the family doctor, examined her, and also the colon on the inside where the internal hemorrhoids were, and it was all smooth, all clean, and all of the little nodules were gone.
Sauber, diese ganzen Knötchen, alles weg.
Meine lieben Heilungssuchenden, jeder Heilungssuchende kann nur empfangen, wenn sich von seinem Leiden frei macht. Lassen Sie bitte von Ihrem Leiden ab. Und so sende ich Ihnen hier mit die Heilwelle, nehmen Sie sie auf, beobachten Sie Ihren Körper weiter, horchen Sie in Ihrem Körper rein, konzentrieren Sie sich darauf, was in Ihrem Körper geschieht. Es gibt vieles, das nicht erklärt werden, aber nichts, das nicht geschehen kann.
As a result of the medical profession's severe attacks, the positive attitude of the Bavarian ministry also changes. Just as in Herford, the situation gets worse and worse for Gröning. He never wanted the mass gatherings that were caused by the sensational reports, and he realizes that it can't go on like this. Yet the worse things get at the Traberhof, the more people offer him help.
Ja, dann tauchte ein Herr Meckelburg auf mit seiner Frau.
Mr. Mechelburg turned up with his wife and offered to, so to speak, organize a healing center for him on the island of Wangerooge, and some kind of contracts were signed. I don't know what he signed. I was immediately booted out, so to speak.
Was unterschrieben hat, ich wurde sofort abserviert, sozusagen.
Later, it was also said that they didn't need me there because I sided with him too much. They said I would have been too devoted to him. And suddenly, they all disappeared and we sat there. And he was on the island of Wangerooge.
Er war auf der Insel Wangerooge.
So one day in the winter of 1949-50, we heard that Mr. Gröning, a miracle healer, was coming to Wangerooge. Then we could hardly wait because we had never heard of him before. One evening, as I was coming from my parents' house on Sedeo Street, a stream of travelers came towards me. It was terrible, on stretchers and wheelchairs and with crutches, and I thought, where in the world are all the people going?
Ich dachte, wo wollen die Menschen bloß alle hin? Ja, entwickelt sich ein gewaltiger Run. Hunderte von Leuten.
A tremendous run developed here. Hundreds of people engulfed Wangerooge, so that the ferry connection had to be restored again, because the season was long since over. New life began here again.
Das fing neues Leben an.
Otto Meckelburg organized lectures with Bruno Gröning in different places on Wangerooge. Within a short time, he is also well known on the island. Miss Janssen is in the cinema with her mother when Gröning gives one of his lectures there.
Bruno Gröning bin ich begegnet, da war ich 5 Jahre alt.
I met Bruno Gröning when I was 5 years old. I had severe eczema that was really terrible. My entire body itched, and I tried to scratch all over. And I don't mean just scratch, but really dug into my flesh and actually tore out little pieces.
Fürchterliche Schmerzen.
Terribly painful. The itching stays until you scratch it open and blood flows. Then it goes away.
Dann geht es. Es war für meine Mutter.
It was terrible for my mother and also for me. Certainly when a child is always crying and in pain. And she, too, grasped at every last straw that was offered to her. Then she heard that Bruno Gröning was coming and that he was a miracle healer who could help everyone. So she took me there.
Helfen könnte. Naja, und da sind mit mir dann hin.
In the cinema, there was a big commotion and annoyance because he wasn't there, because it was taking so long. He had been announced for 8 o'clock and at 11 o'clock, and then at 12 o'clock he still wasn't there. And then I fell asleep between my mother's knees, and finally he came, and there was complete silence.
Vollkommene Stille. Und alle die...
All those who had trouble walking were supposed to go onto the stage. It was a cinema stage, and there were a few steps.
Und die haben tatsächlich vorne die Krücken weggeschmissen.
And they actually threw their crutches away up front and pushed the wheelchairs aside and went up and made a semicircle or a circle around him. And then as my mother grabbed me under her arm and went up there, they looked very shocked, but made way. Bruno Gröning stood there in the middle and said, "What do you want here?"
Bruno Gröning stand da mittendrin und hat gesagt, was wollen Sie denn hier? Glauben Sie nicht?
Don't you believe? Then she said, if I didn't believe Mr. Gröning, I wouldn't be standing here. And then very quickly she pulled up my sleeves and said, "Help my child, that's why I'm here."
Darum bin ich hier. Und dann hat sich, hatte Angst gehabt.
I was afraid and thought, oh dear.
Aber dann hat sich da runtergekniet.
But then he knelt down so that he was as big as I was, and I could look him right in the eyes. And then I was calm, and everything was good, and I thought, he's going to help me now.
Und dann hat bloß die Hände genommen.
Then he just made a sweeping gesture with his hands over me and said to my mother, Go home and don't worry. Your child is well, and get it checked by your family doctor in 2 weeks.
Arzt kontrollieren. Und wir sind nach Hause gegangen und ich habe zum
And we
ersten
went home and I slept through the whole night for the first time. And they said I also slept through to the next afternoon without ever moving my arms to scratch.
ohne überhaupt meine Arme zu bewegen, zu kratzen. Ja, nach 14
So after 2 weeks, my mother took me to the family doctor, and he was able to confirm that it was gone. It was really gone.
Ja, die Narben habe ich hier am Arm. So sieht das aus.
I have these scars here on my arm. That's how it looks. And this is how I stood in front of Bruno Gröning as a little child. And you can see from these white spots how big the scars were. Nothing helped until we went to Bruno Gröning. Yes, and after the healing there was nothing more. It was gone.
Und seit dieser Heilung ist gar nichts mehr. Es ist weg.
Ich erlebte, das war in Wangerooge.
I experienced, it was in Wangerooge, that a teacher came who walked laboriously with a cane.
Und der kam auf Gröning zu und Gröning sprach irgendwas zu
He
ihm.
went up to Gröning, and Gröning said something to him, taking his cane. And what astonished me back then was that he stretched his arm out, the right one, broke the cane over his arm and said to the teacher, "You don't need that anymore."
Brauchen sie nicht mehr. Ich habe den am nächsten Tag.
The next day, that teacher went back with the same train. I think he went to Aurich, I'm not sure. I saw the teacher sitting in the train 2 coaches away.
Aber Waggons weiter saß, sah ich plötzlich den Lehrer sitzen.
I was delighted. I went up to him and asked, "How are you doing now?" "Great," he said. "It's all gone." He could walk well without back pain. Everything wonderful.
Großartig. Ja, das was.
So what my father-in-law, who was the head physician at a hospital here, always said is true. There are things between heaven and earth that even we physicians can't explain. It's true.
Ist schon so.
Gröning fell more and more under the influence of Mecklenburg. He had bound himself tightly to him by contract. In just a short time, this proved to be very disadvantageous for Gröning.
Das war im Februar, das weiß ich noch, bin ich
It was in
hingefahren.
February. I still remember that I went there. I had the money for the trip there, but not for the trip back. And the hotel where he was staying, on the island of Wangerooge, was called the Air Station. It was near the airport. I went there, and only Mr. Kruse is there, no one else. So I spoke to Mr. Kruse, and he says, well, he also didn't get it, how it works. And I said, where is he? I have to talk to him. I have to talk to Bruno. Yes, he said, he's out in the country, at Carolinenziel, out there somewhere. Mecklenburg took him out there, and they're doing healings.
Dann stellte sich
It
heraus,
turned out that Mecklenburg had taken money in advance everywhere, and large amounts, with the promise that Bruno was coming.
Dass Betrüger war, habe ich natürlich nicht gleich erkannt.
At first, I didn't notice that he was a fraud. He actually gave the outward impression of being normal, with perhaps a somewhat distracted look in retrospect. But I've already said that he even swindled my wife's brother out of thousands. He borrowed it, but didn't pay anything back. And then it turned out he was just a fraud.
Und nichts zurückgezahlt. Bis ich herausstellte, dass eben Betrüger war.
Da darf ich vielleicht noch mal auf die...
May I perhaps go back to the general situation of that time again? Back then, I wrote a journal recording certain events.
Fertig, wo einige Vorgänge festgehalten wurden. Und zwar laut Aussagen eines...
Namely, according to the statement of the proprietor there at the railway station in Carolinenziel, that the manager used extortionate methods there too. I knew a windmill owner who personally confirmed to me that this man had demanded an amount of about 500 marks from him, for which he was to be admitted to treatment by Mr. Gröning. He said he was ready to pay 200 marks, but was turned down with the repeated demand for 500. He then reported the matter to the police in Wittmund, and there was already a big file with similar reports on hand. He too knew of a case where this man had demanded 2,000 marks for a visit from Mr. Gröning.
Bekannt, wo dieser Mann für einen Besuch von Herrn Gröning 2000 Mark verlangt hat. Außerdem...
In addition, he is supposed to have said, Gröning is my best stud in the stable. I once had 1.5 million, and now I'll get 3 times that much again. Gröning does what I want. If not, then I'll use force. And Kuhlmann sticks up for Gröning too much and is too devoted to him.
Ich traf dann Bruno Gröning mit seiner ganzen Begleitung, auch seinem
Then I met Bruno Gröning with his entire entourage, his manager too, at this railway station in Carolinensiel before they boarded ship. And as soon as I came into view, they immediately isolated him from me. He just passed by me quickly and said, "Get me out of here," and then he was gone and no longer accessible to me.
Für mich nicht mehr zugänglich.
Mecklenburg, against whom there are meanwhile various charges, retreats with Gröning to Mittenwald. There he wants to set up a healing center.
Ich hatte eine gute Freundin, das war die Maria Laventhaler.
I had a good friend, Maria Laventhaler, and she told me what she had experienced. For 3 weeks she searched for Bruno Gröning and finally found him in Mittenwald.
Endlich gefunden. Stand vor dem Haus und der Herr Mecklenburg hat ihr
She stood before the house when Mr. Mecklenburg opened the door and said, "Mr. Gröning isn't here. He isn't here," and that she should leave. "And by the way," he said, "you'll have to pay at least 300 marks if you want to see him."
Es ist 300 Mark bezahlen, wenn Sie zu ihm vorwollen. Und sagte, ich habe kein Geld.
Then she said, "I don't have any money, but I'm going to wait here until Mr. Gröning comes." And she wouldn't be talked out of it, and waited in the hallway. Mr. Mecklenburg didn't like that.
Das war dem Herrn Mecklenburg nicht recht. Nach 5 Minuten...
After 5 minutes, the door above opened, and Mr. Gröning came down to her and said, "Come here to me." So she was able to be with him for 3 hours, and experienced wonderful things, and was also helped without paying anything.
Bekommen, ohne was zu zahlen. Und sie hat mir gegenüber des Öfteren erwähnt.
She often said to me, "What kind of people does Bruno Gröning have around him who only want to fill their own pockets?" Now that she knew for sure that Mr. Gröning didn't take anything at all, and that Mecklenburg only worked to fill his own pockets. And that made her so angry.
Seine Tasche gearbeitet hätte. Und das hat sie so empört.
Otto Mecklenburg's shady activities also damage Bruno Gröning's public reputation. Mecklenburg and Gröning also visit healing seekers in Bad Wiessee. There, for the first time, he comes into contact with Emil Kufus and his daughter Ruth, who is suffering from tuberculosis. Both of them have lost faith in the help of physicians. Mecklenburg arranges a meeting with Emil Kufus and forces Gröning to have further meetings with him.
Mr. Kufus and his daughter have got to be visited in any case. They still place great trust and faith in you.
However, I know what's to happen with this girl. I also can't help her anymore. That's why I advised them earlier that under no circumstances should medical attention be discontinued, because I also know how dangerous...
That may all be true, but I still want us to visit them anyway. Remember our contract. If you still refuse to go along with me, I'll sue you for breach of contract. And that can be expensive, my dear man. I wouldn't take that chance if I were you. I promise you that in case of breach of contract, I'll sue you for a large sum of money. I think we understand each other.
Despite the great pressure from Otto Mecklenburg, Bruno Gröning finally manages to free himself from the clutches of his manager. Gröning is right about the case of Ruth Kufus. She passes away on December the 30th, 1950. This has far-reaching consequences for him later. A short time later, Gröning receives an offer from a healing practitioner named Eugen Enderlin. He puts his practice at his disposal so that Gröning can hold faith lectures there under medical supervision. Enderlin had already sent patients to Gröning during the Traberhof period. He writes about his observations in a newspaper article. Last year I myself advised several of my patients who, in all probability, could not be helped by contemporary healing methods to try to see Bruno Gröning. The patients went to the Traberhof but remained under my treatment. In this way I was able to determine by follow-up examinations in my practice whether Bruno Gröning's influence had brought them healing or an improvement in their health.
Enderlin war schon ein älterer Herr.
Enderlin was already an elderly gentleman, and things were set up as follows. To deal with these mass gatherings in an orderly fashion, and also to keep from being so legally vulnerable, these patients from Mr. Enderlin were examined in advance by a doctor who was also working there then.
Wir haben Enderlin voruntersucht von einer Ärztin, die damals auch tätig war dort. Und der Enderlin hat immer
Enderlin always gave a short speech explaining what it was all about.
Erklärt also, was es geht.
Es war so, dass ich sehr skeptisch war und in Wirklichkeit überhaupt nicht glauben konnte.
I was very skeptical and could not really believe what was reported about in the magazines and newspapers. And to be honest, I wanted to see what was behind the whole swindle.
Und saß nun da und der Herr Enderlin.
So I sat there, and Mr. Enderlin gave his introductory lecture and spoke about Bruno Gröning, who he was, all that he could do, his abilities, what he had experienced through him, and it was very interesting.
Das war sehr interessant. Und dann auf einmal sagte er, beobachten Sie Ihren Körper jetzt.
And then he suddenly said, observe your body now, but don't think of the illness. Think of something beautiful, something that gives you joy or prey. And so I thought of an experience I had had the day before. I had experienced the sunrise at Lake Werther while on the train.
Bei der Bahnfahrt. Und wie ich das Bild so vor mir hatte.
And while I had that picture in my head and was thinking, oh, you have such a beautiful homeland, a force entered my big toes and tingled up to my head.
Bis zum Kopf hinauf und ich bekam.
And I got a headache, pain here in my liver, and here in this area. And there was a tingling going up to and out of my fingertips, and I felt the pain exactly in the places where there was illness in me.
Und der Enderlin erklärte das dann.
And Mr. Enderlin explained that it was the healing stream, and that we should continue to observe it, that the illness comes from evil and doesn't belong to man at all.
Und mit gar nicht zu Menschen gehört.
And that this healing stream gets rid of it through the head, hands and feet.
Als Herr Gröning kam, waren diese Schmerzen.
When Mr. Gröning came in, the pain was suddenly 3 times stronger, and when he then said, it goes out through the head, hands and feet, how was that supposed to work? For 15 years I had chronic frontal sinus catarrh, and the suppuration was encrusted and hardened and advanced, and the doctor said, we can do nothing more, you are facing dementia.
Sie gehen ihrer Verblödung entgegen. Und die zweite unheilbare Krankheit.
And the second incurable illness was liver damage that I had contracted while on duty in Yugoslavia during the war. I had jaundice. I couldn't be treated and couldn't follow a diet. So, years later, I went to a doctor again and asked, how long do I have to continue this diet? I'm already at the end of my ropes. And he answered, all your life. Your liver cells have been destroyed and won't grow back.
Und die wachsen nicht mehr nach. Und da konnte ich mir auch nicht vorstellen.
So I couldn't imagine that it could go out through your hands and feet. How?
Und das dritte unheilbar war Unterzucker.
And the third incurable thing was hypoglycemia to the extent of dizzy spells. I had to take 7 or 8 cubes of fructose daily to be able to exist, not to speak of being healed.
Aber das kann man nicht erklären, aber erleben. Und ich habe es so erlebt, dass nach dem Vortrag.
But you can't explain it, you have to experience it. My experience was that after the lecture the pain suddenly let up, and all at once I had the feeling of being 100 pounds lighter. Such a wonderful feeling, and a feeling of happiness came over me. I had a feeling that that could only be good health.
Und ich ging dann zu Bruno Gröning hin.
And then I went over to Bruno Gröning with such enthusiasm and gratitude, shook his hand and said, Mr. Gröning, I have the feeling that I am completely healthy. I thank you.
Und schaute mich so
And he
an.
looked at me in such a way that his gaze went through my whole body. And then he said, You don't only feel that way, you are, too. You are healthy. But don't thank me, thank God. He did it.
Hat das getan. Das konnte ich überhaupt nicht verstehen.
I couldn't understand that at all. And the next day, I didn't need to take any pills, and I didn't get dizzy, which was inexplicable to me.
Es kam kein Schwindelgefühl, was für mich unerklärlich war. Ich konnte den ärgsten...
I broke my diet in the worst way, had no more pain, and so I wanted to know how that works. Mr. Gröning is also just a human being like the rest of us, and what had he said? Thank God, he did it. And at that moment, I knew indeed that there was a Lord God.
Es gibt einen Herrgott.
I have remained healthy, and my whole life was turned around.
Mein ganzes Leben umgedreht.
Out of gratitude, Greta Häusler becomes a close associate of Gröning. Here too, there is no relapse of the old ailments. However, Bruno Gröning is also disappointed by Enderlin. He too turns out to be a wheeler and dealer. Gröning separates from Enderlin because of the worst kind of profiteering, embezzlement, slander and breach of contract. Later, Enderlin even claims that he can work in the same way as Gröning. A certain Dr. Trampler, who in the beginning organizes lectures for Bruno Gröning, later also claims to be a healer. He is even cited in a newspaper as saying, Bruno Gröning is a mere baby compared to me. Why does Gröning continually come across the wrong people? Why can't he see their true character? Is he just too gullible? Or doesn't he have any insight into human nature?
Unterwegs sagte ich zu Herrn Gröning.
On the way, I said to Mr. Gröning, I wish you one thing in the future, that you no longer have any enemies, and that you can work undisturbed, that no one is against you.
Dass niemand gegen sie ist. Und schaute mich so liebevoll.
And then he looked at me so lovingly and said, completely wrong. And I think, oh, what have I said wrong now?
Und sagte, das muss ja so sein.
And then he said, it has to be like that. I allow certain people to approach me, and then let them get very close to me. Otherwise, people wouldn't believe if I predicted that he was a thief, a liar, or swindler. And therefore, I have to give those people an opportunity to lie, swindle, and steal.
Die Gelegenheit geben, zu lügen, zu betrügen und zu stehlen. Aber ich sage ihm, das soll man nicht tun.
But I tell them that one shouldn't do that it is not permitted, and then, when the time comes and they don't change, at some point I turn them in.
Irgendwann, dann stelle ich ihn.
Since several of Gröning's associates are obviously acting out of a desire for profit, the question arises whether he himself is not also pursuing financial gain.
Also diese Vorwürfe haben wir oft über uns ergehen lassen müssen.
We often had to put up with such charges, and I can only say that he'd had absolutely nothing to do with making money, and moreover, he always rejected it. He possessed no money at all, and often used the expression, money is the devil. He had a negative attitude toward money, and we were also strongly forbidden to accept money, not even for him.
Anzunehmen, auch nicht für ihn.
Was man ihm da so andichtete, das ja.
What they implied about him, that he had nothing against accepting payments, was in my opinion going too far because he really never accepted money. It was more those around him who were concerned with it, and it's a shame that he was blamed for things that are not supported by the facts. He himself was very modest and simple in his needs.
Sehr bescheiden, genügsam.
Und da erlebte ich was Interessantes.
And then I experienced something interesting. He suddenly showed us how much money he had. He dug into his pockets, sort of like this, and then he laid 37 cents on the table. That was all he had. Also, I never saw him take any money.
Dass je ein Geld angenommen hat.
Eben Geld war für ihn unwichtig.
Money was unimportant for him. What was? Well, the most important thing in life for most people was unimportant for him. The simple laws of life, they were important for him. He was a very simple, modest man, undemanding.
Ganz anspruchslos für sich persönlich. Ich kenne ihn eigentlich immer.
I knew him as always being dressed the same. A polo shirt, gray trousers, that was his summer dress. In the winter he also had a gray jacket over that, during the cold season. But it was really always the same.
Aber das war eigentlich immer das Gleiche. Und vor allen Dingen...
And above all, since he did, after all, stay with me sometimes, I was able to see how frugal he was with food and drink. He told me that everywhere he went, people thought they had to set a huge meal before him, and he didn't like that at all.
Ihm nur so ein groß, mächtiges Menü vorsetzen, und das liebte er überhaupt nicht.
Als ich den gesehen habe, wie der angezogen war. When I saw how he was dressed, he couldn't have made any money because he would have bought himself something else to wear. Because he didn't exactly go around looking fashionable. Well, he was always in old rags. I say rags, although maybe they weren't rags, but he never attached any importance at all to external things, never. So he definitely didn't give the impression that he was in any way materialistic. To me, it seemed that he had very high ideals.
Das war für mich irgendwo, waren lauter ideelle Einstellungen, die der hatte.
Ich habe aber den Eindruck, dass nie damit, also nie ein Mann war.
But I had the impression that he was never a man who had the desire to draw people to him, or maybe make people pay, or to gather only wealthy patients around him and sort them out, like, who will I take and who won't I take? All in all, he just wanted to help people.
Ich nicht. Das alles, er wollte den Menschen helfen.
Ich habe nie den Eindruck von ihm gehabt, dass auf Geld überhaupt Wert legt.
I never got the impression from him that he placed much worth in money. It never played a role in my presence, whether someone was rich or poor. I was also poor. I was just a little nurse. But I never had the feeling that I was less valuable than other people, much wealthier than I was.
Bei ihm als andere, die viel reicher waren wie ich. Ne?
Das war überhaupt kein Thema, Geld. Wir waren damals alle nach dem Krieg.
That just never came up. Money. Back then, after the war, we were all poor. And I still remember how Bruno Gröning said in the lecture, if you have 2 coats or 2 shirts, turning toward the men, if you have 2 shirts and a poor person comes up to you and asks for one of them, then give him one of them.
Bittet sie eins, dann geben sie ihm eins ab.
Jetzt legten verschiedene überall Geld hin. Und
different people would lay money everywhere around here. And a few times he said, take back your money, but they didn't take their money back. Then Mr. Gröning gathered up the money and put it in a woman's pocket. And it turned out later that the woman he had given the money to was a poor war widow. And she couldn't believe that something like that could still happen.
Und die konnte sich ja nicht mehr fassen, dass sowas noch gibt.
Da stand eine Schale auf dem Tisch, weil alle Menschen sich selber Gedanken machten.
There was a bowl on the table because everyone had wondered, how does Bruno Gröning get here and back? We have to do something. He has to have something for his travel expenses. So the bowl was there, and anyone who wanted to could put something into it. But he never asked anyone for anything.
Verlangt hat niemand was.
Das wäre sicher auch unter seiner Würde gewesen. Das passte nicht zu ihm.
That would certainly have been beneath his dignity. It wasn't like him. It's still the same today. The ones who are charlatans, some kind of quasi-spiritual healers or something, well, they ask for God knows what.
Geistheiler oder irgend sowas. Ja, die verlangen weiß Gott was. Und diejenigen, die wirklich was können.
But the ones who really can do something don't ask for anything, because there is a cosmic law. When someone asks payment for the gift God has given him, his power will decrease, and the gift will be taken away, for it doesn't come from him, but rather through him.
Aus ihm, sondern durch ihn.
Es ist überhaupt nie von Geld irgendwie die Rede gewesen.
There was absolutely no talk about money in any way. I never saw, as was later said, a plate set out somewhere that you could lay something on. No, I didn't see that. A lot was written in the press afterward and later about how he would have been able to live very well from what he received. But I was never asked for anything.
Aber von mir ist nie etwas verlangt worden.
Bruno Gröning is continually confronted by reporters who don't want to get to the truth, but only want something sensational to report.
Die Familie Kellner.
Then the Kellner family later showed me this pavilion here and said that Mr. Gröning very often sat at the table and worked.
Gröning sehr oft da gesessen ist, am Tisch und gearbeitet hat. Und es gibt ein wunderschönes Bild.
And there is a beautiful picture of Bruno Gröning there in the pavilion with the dog beside him.
Und es gibt eine Illustrierte. Und da ist so ein
And there was a magazine that used such a picture with an article saying something to the effect that
geschrieben, so hat Bruno Gröning.
This is how Gröning enjoys life in southern France on the Riviera. And this is how he squandered and used the donations of the poorest of the poor.
Der Armen so verprasst und verwendet. Ich war so empört.
I was so outraged by this lie and this slander. And I knew that so much which they wrote about him was just as made up. There was no end to the slander.
Ist verleumdet worden bis aufs Letzte. Ich habe auch andere Dinge.
I also experienced other things that the press twisted around. And that's what this pavilion reminds me of so much today.
Heute so daran.
Gröning is often not only misrepresented in the press, but also caricatured as an object of ridicule. His healing success is made to look ridiculous. They don't hesitate to defame and slander him.
Wie mir von seinen Kämpfen erzählte mit der Presse, mit der Ärztekammer.
This is what he told me about his battles with the press, the medical association, and so forth. They tried to silence me once and for all. I don't remember exactly what he said. And look up here. There were binders on the shelf, about 10 in number, and he pointed to them and said, "See, in all of them there is bad criticism about me. But that doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me. But it's sad." Then he looked a little melancholic.
Da schaute so ein bisschen melancholisch.
For 10 years, Mr. Behrlein had severe depressions and at times even had to take Valium. In addition, he was plagued by a nervous gastric disorder. Hardly any kind of food agreed with him, and he suffered from severe insomnia. At a lecture by Bruno Gröning, he experienced a spontaneous healing.
Mein Mann war sehr interessiert, was über Bruno.
My husband was very interested. He always bought and read anything written about Bruno Gröning. I, too, always brought home copies of the Saturday evening newspaper. And then suddenly something completely negative was written in the press about Bruno Gröning, stating that it was all just suggestion, the people would all get sick again, and it was all untrue about people getting healthy.
Das ist alles gar nicht wahr, also dass die Menschen gesund davon werden. Und mein Mann,
and my husband, who had already been healed, got such a shock and thought, my goodness, now I'll probably also get sick again. That report frightened him so profoundly. And then he actually did get sick again.
Ja, dieser Bericht. Und es war wirklich so, dass auf einmal wieder die alten Beschwerden bekam.
Gröning said this about the negative reports.
These cheap journalists will do anything to make money. They don't care if the sick get well or the healthy stay that way. The main thing is what they can earn.
An affidavit given by Karl Gröning in the year 1952 makes it clear that some journalists would stop at nothing. He writes, "Since I had been in a state of financial difficulty for a long time, I was approached by a journalist, a certain Karl Hormann, to publish a written exposé against my brother. They told me that I could earn a lot of money with a negative publication containing the heading Brother Against Brother. Mr. Hormann held out the prospect of my earning a good 50,000 marks in this regard. He told me not to be afraid of telling all sorts of lies in order to provide the press with the most sensational material possible. Today, I regret terribly that that could happen, just as I also regret that my brother Bruno's reputation was severely damaged by my earlier, disparaging and false assertions. I hereby take back all the false accusations against my brother Bruno.
Can I pour you some more?
Yes, please. It's taking such a long time. We must have ordered at least half an hour ago.
It doesn't matter. Today we have plenty of time. Here's to you.
To you.
To you.
To you. Say, Fritz, have you heard that they're putting your Gröning on trial?
What do you mean by my Gröning? I was simply impressed by him.
And you fell captive to a charlatan?
Who would have thought it? He actually seemed quite pleasant.
Well, at least the whole fraud is being exposed now. I said right from the start that he only wanted to make money.
Yeah, well, everyone makes mistakes.
I don't know. Perhaps they're doing him a disservice. Nothing has been proven yet.
In 2 or 3 months, at the latest, he'll be sitting behind bars. A person like that never gets far.
In fact, Gröning is charged with having continued to practice healing without permission and thereby with having violated the healing practitioner law. Reports appear continually throughout 1951 and 1952 after it becomes known that he is going to be put on trial. Bruno Gröning turns to attorney Dr. Reuss, who is supposed to defend him at the trial. At the same time, an expert's report is drawn up. They don't consider it necessary to question Gröning personally, and it is based exclusively on media articles and Karl Gröning's slanderous document. They come to the following judgment. One could describe Gröning as an impulsive personality with many infantile traits and with less than average ability. He appears to be quite pathological in the sense of a neurotic personality development. In any case, at the time of the events in question, it was a matter of an emotionally abnormal personality. In court in Munich, Gröning has to answer to the charge of unauthorized practice of healing for the first time. He is acquitted in the first court case and then also in the case of March 19, 1952. In the appeal proceedings, this acquittal is confirmed, but only on the grounds of involuntary error. That is, he was given credit for not knowing that he was probably violating the healing practitioner law. Fundamentally, however, his healing activity is judged according to the healing practitioner law. Thus, the acquittal amounts to a court-ordered healing prohibition. With this measure, his hands are finally tied. Forced by circumstances, Bruno Gröning decides, against his earlier intention, to become a healing practitioner in order to be able to finally work freely. On April 2, 1953, he submits the relevant application. Eugen Enderlin confirms that he has already prepared Gröning as a healing practitioner and that he regards him as being capable of working in this occupation. The State Association of Healing Practitioners in Stuttgart also speaks positively. We confirm that Mr. Bruno Gröning has the prerequisite knowledge, confirmed through an examination which he applied for, to meet the requirements to attain the official authorization as a healing practitioner. We consider it sufficient and have no objections to his being an authorized healing practitioner. But Gröning's application is rejected on August 12, 1953, based mainly on the superficially researched expert opinion. The following reasons were given. He doesn't possess the moral dependability required for the practice of healing. As a result of weaknesses in his mental and emotional powers, your client lacks the required aptitude to work in this occupation. The practice of healing by your client would constitute a danger to public health. Thereafter, on November the 22nd, 1953, Gröning founds the Gröning Association. In future, he only wants to work as a travelling lecturer giving lectures on faith. Above all, he strives for an orderly structure and hopes for a certain protection from the association. He is supported by well-known personalities such as Count Zeppelin, Count Matuschka and the Baroness Annie Ebner von Eschenbach. He has gained great respect from many people. They want to show their gratitude by helping him in his difficult situation. Bruno Gröning is convinced that no one can forbid him to hold his faith lectures. He refers to freedom of speech. He believes he has finally found a way that is legally incontestable. Gröning establishes so-called communities. Now he usually speaks to people on a smaller scale. It is his desire to offer the help and healing seekers an opportunity to convince themselves of his teachings. Private rooms are usually provided for this. In this way, Mrs. Tiede from Schleswig meets Gröning and is healed from severe anxiety attacks. She also witnesses other healings.
Dann sind wir in einen großen Saal reingegangen. Ich weiß nicht, wie viele Menschen drin waren, 200, 250.
Then we went into a big hall. I don't know how many people were in it, whether it was 200 or 250. I can't say anymore. In any case, the hall was jam-packed, and Bruno Gröning came and held a lecture. Just before he began to speak, another person was carried in and was put down in the back. He wasn't able to walk alone.
Wurde hinten im Saal hingelegt. Er konnte alleine nicht gehen. Und ich weiß nicht, wie lange der Vortrag sich hingezogen hat, so anderthalb.
I don't know how long the lecture lasted. Maybe 1.5 or 2 hours. And then in conclusion, Bruno Gröning went through the hall along the rows, asking people here and there, "How are you? How do you feel? And how do you feel here?"
Wie geht es Ihnen hier? Und unter anderem zeigte dann auf mich.
Among others, he also pointed at me. I was sitting in the corner. And he said, "And you?" Then I said, "Once I touched an unprotected electric wire and got such a shock. Well, that's what's happening now in my body."
Immer durch meinen Körper durch. Während des Vortrags noch.
During the lecture, someone else from the crowd said, "Mr. Gröning, there's someone lying back here." And then he said, "I don't forget anyone."
Und wie dieser Vortrag
And when the lecture was finished, that gentleman stood up, went to the bar, and asked for a shot of liquor.
The sensational healing of Thies Pasch is recorded in a success report. The Gröning Association arranges for these reports to be recorded in order to document the healings.
You see, we knew this man from the town here. And there were people who say, "Oh, that was all just show." But we knew this man, and suddenly he stands up and walks. I don't know anymore how long he was paralyzed. He was an elderly man. And you can imagine how thoroughly amazed everybody was that something like that could happen.
Im Häuschen, wie sowas angehen kann.
As time goes on, Mrs. Tiede becomes a co-worker in the Gröning Association. He even stays with her now and then when travelling. Gröning travels untiringly and holds his faith lectures. He says,
"In spite of all the opposition, I will continue striving to help my friends and their suffering fellow human beings. I am not dependent on man, but rather on God. For me, there is no human law that forbids me such a thing. For me, there's only one law, and that is the divine one."
During a community hour, Adolf Groth meets Bruno Gröning. He was suffering from stomach cancer and had been given up by the doctors.
Der Krieg, der hat uns gestempelt. Der Krieg
The war put its stamp on us. The war destroyed us. That was the whole thing. Emotionally destroyed. During the war, we weren't normal human beings. We were hyenas. As a normal human being, you can't shoot anyone. But we had to. Either you or me. That's not normal.
Entweder du oder ich. Das ist doch nicht mehr normal. Unser Leben.
And our life was hanging on a thread. And then you looked for something. Just like in the war, where you're the front, you grasp at straws, something you can hold on to.
Wo man sich an festhalten kann. Ne? Jeden Moment kann das aus sein.
It can be over at any moment. It's awful when you experience something like that. It's no wonder that we got sick, that we were emotionally destroyed.
Krank wurden, da wir seelisch kaputt. Ich stand noch mit einem Bein im Grab.
I stood with one leg in the grave. That's how sick I was.
Nee, ich wollte Hilfe.
I wanted help.
Nee, konnte nicht mehr essen und nichts.
I couldn't eat anything anymore. Nothing.
Und wie ich später erfahren habe, mein Hausarzt...
As I later learned, my family doctor said that I had stomach cancer.
Magenkrebs. Und dann sind wir da hingefahren, wie das...
And then we drove over there. I don't know anymore how that came about. Somehow we were with several people. Then we drove there, and then there was salvation. It was salvation for us, for all of us there. The hall was full. That was salvation for everyone.
War das. Für alle. Ne? Also man war wie von neu geboren.
So you felt newborn. That's how light you felt. The heaviness went out of the body.
Aus dem Körper raus. Ne, und in dem Moment und auch noch
And at
wieder...
that moment, and also thereafter, as we drove away, we weren't sick anymore. We didn't perceive anything, any more of the sickness. It was gone. And as soon as I got back, I could eat again. And it didn't come back again.
Und kam auch nicht wieder. So einfach. Aber das...
That's simple. But that was the transmission of Gröning's powers, which he radiated. And the body was charged up, and then the body could run freely again, a free current, you could say. Then everything can function normally again.
Mal so sagen, dann kann alles wieder normal gehen. Ne, und wer das nicht glauben will, der muss das sein lassen. Ne, aber mein Glauben...
And if you can't believe, then just forget about it. But nobody can take my belief away from me. I have this attitude. I had it back then, and I still have it. And I do very well with it.
Und ich fahre gut mit. Ich werde alt.
I'm getting old.
Ne,
I am old, or getting old. How do you say it? And that is the most beautiful thing. I take joy in life. That I'm still here, and that I'm still healthy.
Und dass ich noch gesund bin.
In the year 1950, Bruno Gröning met Josette Dufossé. During the time that follows, she accompanies him more and more and supports him in his work. They become closer and finally marry in June 1955. However, Bruno Gröning combines this with an extraordinary stipulation.
Hatte mir gesagt, du bist nicht die Erste in meinem
He said to me, "You don't come first in my life. The sick come first. And you know what you should do. Either you go, or you stay and accept that." I said, "I stay." And so I also lived with the sick. Yes, I also did einstellen. For me, that was my destiny.
Das war für mich das Schicksal. Ja. Und wir waren sehr viel unterwegs.
And very often we were on the road, and very often he had acquaintances or friends, a whole circle of friends. The people wanted to be near him, because they sensed that through him there was a change in their body and an improvement. And that's why they always wanted to be near him.
Und deshalb immer wollte sie bei ihm sein. Wenn eine Frau oder ein Mann...
When a woman or a man came to him saying, "Mr. Gröning, I have pain here," he would turn around and say, "Where's the pain?"
Ich hab kein mehr.
"I don't have it anymore."
So war es.
That's how it was.
Und
then he was gone. And they looked so... That happened so often. "Mr. Gröning, help me, my back, my back." "In your back there?" "No, but I have..."
Aber ich habe plötzlich aufgehört.
Suddenly, it had stopped, was gone.
Und hat den Bürger nicht gefragt.
And he didn't ask, who are you, where are you from, and were you such and such? Nothing. He just turned and was gone.
Und ich immer hinterhin.
And I always walked after him. Oh yes.
Ja.
Ich weise Sie darauf hin, liebe Freunde. Jeder Mensch hat es nötig, Gott zu ersuchen, dass ihn wieder auf den Weg zurückführt, der wirklich von Gott so bestimmt ist. Und so rufe ich Sie, so rufe ich jeden zu, halt! So du wahrgenommen, dass dieser Weg, den du eingeschlagen, dass dieser Weg nicht der richtige, niemals der gute, sondern nur der ungute ist, dann halte. Dann gehe nicht weiter diesen Weg. Ich sage, auf zur großen Umkehr. Vertraue und glaube. Es hilft, es heilt, die göttliche Kraft. Folge du dem alle zu folgen. Und dieser eine ist und bleibt Gott selbst, liebe Freunde, dem wir zu folgen haben. Denn das Unheil schwindet erst dann, so der Mensch sich selbst, das heißt, wieder mit Gott verbindet. Glauben Sie an das Gute. Glauben Sie an das Göttliche. Glauben Sie an Gott. Schenken Sie Ihren Körper wirkliche Beachtung. Lösen Sie sich von allem Bösen. Nehmen Sie die gute göttliche Kraft in sich auf. So werden Sie nicht was, sondern das wahrnehmen, dass das Böse aus Ihrem Körper schwindet. Liebe das Leben, Gott. Gott ist überall. Geld ist Macht. Gesundheit ist Allmacht.
Was bei ihm kam aus seinem Herzen.
What came from his heart. And that should in no way be regarded as dumb, but rather as quite wise. He was able to express fundamental things in simple words. I always emphasize in simple words, so that everyone could understand it, and that was the important thing.
Das war auch das, was wichtig war.
Und dann war eine Schale nach unten gekehrt.
And then there was a bowl lying upside down somewhere, I think on a table. He took it, turned it right side up, with the opening facing upward, and said, "That's what your attitude should be, not the other way around. Only when you open yourself up can something be let in, can you receive. Otherwise it's not possible." I experienced that with Mrs. Dichtel.
So bei Frau Dichtel erlebt.
War sehr für Symbolik.
He liked symbolism very much. For him, everything was simple. Do you understand? That was his greatness. His simplicity was his greatness. Whether he was aware of it or not aware of it, it was simply so.
War es einfach. Das ist das Schöne an ihm.
That was the beautiful thing about him. He never bragged or anything. No, I never heard that.
Habe ich nicht gehört. War, wenn man sagt, niedrig.
As people say, viewed externally, he was from the lower class. But Jesus was also only a carpenter. What do people expect? That is no measure of a person.
Das ist für eine Persönlichkeit.
I only want to be a guide for humankind in that I show them the right path, the path to God. I want to bring humankind back to faith. I never ask a person his religion or nation. Human being is human being. There is no difference.
Ja, gläubiger Mensch war ich schon immer, auch vor Bruno Gröning.
Yes, I always was a man of faith, even before Bruno Gröning. And Bruno Gröning didn't lead me onto a different path, but instead he strengthened the faith that I already had before. For even if you really believe, that's actually nothing new. What Bruno Gröning said, however, with the intensity as he taught me, no one had told me that before.
Das hat mir noch niemand gesagt. Also, es heißt ja, es gibt ja Wallfahrtsorte und es gibt wo irgendjemand
For
religiös
example, there are places of pilgrimage and there are places with relics or where someone was canonized. And among the people who go there are some that are healed. I knew that there was such a thing, but that Bruno Gröning has this power and ability to bring healing to me into my own living room, I didn't know that this was possible, and that's what he showed us.
diese Kraft hat, das mir in die Wohnstube zu bringen, das habe ich nicht gewusst. Und das hat er uns gezeigt.
Bruno Gröning described himself as follows.
I don't know much. I only know what people no longer know today. I only want to be a guide. I'm only a little tiny tool of God. And don't ever say that I healed you. Never. I'm only a little go-between. Nothing more. A little transformer. People who have received healing should thank God for it. I'm nothing. God is everything. I also don't have to be present for you to receive the healing wave. It doesn't depend on my body.
Freunde von uns hatten uns eingeladen und ich hörte nur, dass ein Heiler.
Friends of ours had invited us over, and I only knew that we and a healer were invited. I found that very nice, and we went. I went with severe stomach pain, for I had already suffered for years from stomach pain.
An Magenschmerzen. Wir saßen dann in diesem sehr schönen Raum mit ungefähr 50.
We sat in this very beautiful room with about 15 or 18 people, all of them acquaintances of Baron Napurov and his wife, waiting for Gröning. And we waited for quite a while, as he was late.
Gröning, und wir warteten ziemlich lange. Hat sich verspätet. Nach etwa einer Stunde ging's
After about an hour, the telephone rang, and the Baroness went out, then came back in and said, "Well, Bruno Gröning is already in Munich, and he's already here in this room in thought, and will arrive in a few minutes."
Mit seinen Gedanken schon hier in diesem Raum, und wird in ein paar Minuten kommen. Gut. Jetzt waren alle sehr gespannt, das hat man gespürt.
Well, everyone was very expectant. You could sense that. And I noticed after a few minutes that my stomach pain was gone. And for years I had had very severe stomach pain, almost every day, and very severe headaches. Everything had a nervous origin.
Kopfschmerzen. Alles nervlich bedingt.
Yes, I no longer felt the stomach pain, even before Gröning entered the room.
In den Raum trat. Ich sah dann plötzlich an der Tür eine Gestalt, ich hatte nicht...
Then I suddenly saw a form in the doorway. I hadn't heard him come in. I was already well, and I have never had stomach pain again.
Magenschmerzen gehabt. Nach ungefähr einer Stunde war...
After about an hour, the healing process was completed. He went into an adjoining room, and then my friend came and asked me, "How are you feeling now?"
Und fragte mich, wie geht's dir denn jetzt? Und ich war sehr müde geworden. Und ich hatte
I was very tired and had a very bad headache. Then she said, "Then go into the next room and lie down on the couch." It was just inside the room. And I did that and saw that Gröning was sitting with 2 other people behind a folding screen.
Mit noch 2 Leuten.
So I lay there, and after a very, very short time, he was suddenly standing next to me saying, "How are you feeling?"
Und sagt, wie geht's Ihnen? Sage ich, ja, ich habe so starke Kopfschmerzen.
So I said, "Well, I have such a bad headache." And then he said, "I always do that."
Also stand etwa darum.
He stood there about where my legs are and said, "I always do that."
Und fragt dann,
and then asked, "And now? How are you feeling now?"
Sag ich, ja,
I said, "Well, first I have to sit up." And then I sat up and shook my head a little, like this.
Die Kopfschmerzen waren weg.
And the headache was gone. I had had so many headaches or migraines, but I never got them again.
Nicht mehr bekommen.
Meine Mutter, die war früher sehr, sehr krank. Die hatte...
My mother was very, very sick and had asthma and had open sores on her legs. And through someone or other, she learned that a Mr. Gröning would be coming there to Essen and that he had the ability to help her. And then she was there 1 or 2 times. I don't know anymore how often, and suddenly came back healed.
Und kam auf einmal geheilt wieder.
Also ich hatte schwer Asthma. Es war Herz-, Nerven- und Bronchialasthma.
I had severe asthma. It was heart, nerve, and bronchial asthma. And I always went to the doctor and also changed doctors, but none of them could give me relief. None of them could free me from it. And it was so awful. My husband says 7 years. I don't know whether it was 4 or 5 or 6 years. And I kept having asthma attacks to the point of suffocation.
Immer Erstickungsanfälle. Da musste ich so schweres.
I had to take such strong things and drops, but nothing helped. And I continued having the attacks. They were so awful. My husband can confirm that. I would run from one window to the next, and it was terrible. I couldn't breathe in any air. It was as if I was being strangled. It was so awful. I can't describe what I went through.
Bekommen, als wenn mein Hals zugeschnürt wäre. So schlimm kann ich gar niemand beschreiben, was ich durchgemacht habe. Als ich bei Bruno Gröning war, da habe ich schon gespürt.
When I was with Bruno Gröning, I really felt something. It ran through my entire body. Something was happening there, and then I felt really good.
Als ich mich verabschiedet hat er gesagt,
when I left, he said, "Stay just the way you are, and when you go back now, you will think it is even worse than it was before. And then the reaction will come, and everything will be all right again."
Und dann kommt die Reaktion, und dann ist alles wieder in Ordnung. Und so war's. Ich war zu Hause.
And so it was. I was at home and sat down in my wide leather armchair just as before and couldn't sleep. And then I was in such pain, and I screamed to my husband, "Now it's getting worse than ever."
Und dann war's aus. Auf einmal war's aus.
And then it was over. Suddenly it was over. And I have been healthy all these years, many years, and I haven't had a bit of asthma since then.
Von Asthma nichts mehr gespürt.
Mrs. Willem's healing report is also recorded in writing. She gives an affidavit about what she experienced with her own body.
Der eine Arzt in Duisburg,
The doctor in Duisburg was impressed. He said that it would have been humanly impossible for me to get well again. And he said that I have Bruno Gröning and our Lord God to thank for that.
Und das habe ich dem Herr Gröning zu verdanken und unserem Herrgott, hat gesagt.
Like Mrs. Willems, many people first experience a worsening of symptoms, as with homeopathy. Bruno Gröning explains this process as follows.
If you have pain here and there, don't be afraid, for that is the regulum pain. Health has to fight its way back along the path where everything was out of order, and work on it until the sick organ is in order again.
Als ich zum ersten Mal zu Bruno Gröning kam.
When I went to Bruno Gröning for the first time, we sat down right away in the last row because I was somehow afraid of him, a miracle healer or something. I also didn't really look at him because I thought that his eyes might hypnotize you.
Oder sonst was. Und dann, als ich mich da hingesetzt.
And then when I sat down, he said, in general, we should sit there very relaxed, not tensed up, and keeping everything loose, turn within. And he would then see and feel the problems and concerns that we had.
Fühlen, was wir für Probleme und Anliegen hätten. Und dann habe ich das auch gemacht.
And I did that, and I thought, if only I could be helped to lose some weight. And just as he had asked, I experienced that thought then, completely turned within.
Ganz, wie gesagt hat, ganz in mich gekehrt, so erlebt. So ein paar Minuten war dann ganz still. War auch ganz still.
It was very quiet for a few minutes. He was very quiet, and so were all the others. And then when the evening was over, from then on, I actually did slowly lose a little weight every day. I used to weigh 176 pounds at the age of 17, and 2 years later, at the age of 19, I only weighed 132 pounds. So in 2 years, I lost 44 pounds without a diet, without eating less. On the contrary, after a year, when my mother noticed that I had lost so much weight, she would always spread extra, very good butter on my bread, because she assumed that I was ill.
Und alles aufs Brot schmieren, weil sie annahm, dass ich krank war, schickte mich auch zum Arzt hin. Der Arzt meinte, denn das ist ja nur vom Vorteil.
She also sent me to the doctor. The doctor said that it was simply advantageous that I had lost weight. But of course I didn't tell him that I had gone to this miracle healer, Gröning, you know? But my inner knowledge told me that he had actually helped me.
Dass der tatsächlich geholfen hat, ne?
Beim ersten Zusammensein mit Bruno Gröning war ich so neu.
During my first encounter with Bruno Gröning, I was so new and so skeptical, and the most important thing for me was that I didn't want to be hypnotized or put under suggestion.
Wenn es um geistige Kräfte geht, dann muss man ja aufpassen.
When it comes to spiritual powers, you have to watch out. I once had an experience at a public event years before. I went onto the stage and experienced being hypnotized, and for a long time afterward I had headaches, and then swore, never again. And when I then experienced the healing stream there, I realized that it was something entirely different, which has nothing to do with hypnosis.
Das hat mit Hypnose nichts zu tun.
Hypnose ist eine suggestive Kraft.
Hypnosis is the power of suggestion, and he didn't have that. He sent out a healing vibration, but not this "you must," like with hypnosis. No, that has nothing to do with it.
Mit gar nichts zu tun.
War absolut gegen Hypnose.
He was absolutely against hypnosis. No, absolutely. Never, no. He said he couldn't rob people of their will and say, no, never.
Nein, niemals. Das bei ihm...
With him, when he came, you simply always had to feel. Yes, you had to feel.
Ja.
Bruno Gröning says,
Hypnosis is evil. It should not be used by humankind. I make no use of suggestion. Everyone has a free will.
This is made very clear by Mrs. Diller's statement.
Einmal habe ich etwas sehr Eindrucksvolles erlebt.
Once I experienced something very impressive. I was with my friend in the same flat, completely alone with her.
Und wir haben uns unterhalten und wir haben
We chatted and then played a game of cards very quietly. And it was a hot day.
Es war ganz still und es war ein heißer Tag. Auf einmal geht's Telefon und sie
Suddenly the telephone rings and she goes out and shuts the door. I didn't hear anything and I waited and really didn't think anything. I was also a little tired.
Ich habe eigentlich gar nichts gedacht. Ich war auch ein bisschen müde. Plötzlich merke ich ein leises Kribbeln in den...
Suddenly I noticed a soft tingling in the soles of my feet, and it went higher and higher, very slowly, and I thought to myself, what's going on? Gröning isn't even here.
Es ging immer weiter.
It continued and went through my whole body, into my hands, my arms and hands, and I couldn't hold the fanned-out cards in my hand anymore. So I lay them down, and I was full of a current, stronger than ever before. And I think, what's going on here?
Was soll denn das nur? Nach einer Weile geht die Tür auf.
After a while, the door opens and my friend comes in and says, Bruno Gröning sends his greetings. He just called and says hello.
Und lässt dich grüßen.
I hadn't even thought that it could be Gröning.
Das könnte Gröning sein.
Ich habe Heilungen erlebt. Und zwar ganz eigenartige.
I experienced healings, very unusual ones in fact. We were in Klagenfurt, and I said, unfortunately I have to leave now because I have night duty.
Und hat gesagt, ja, ich begleite Sie.
And then he said, yes, I'll accompany you. And then he accompanied me down 2 flights to the street. And I didn't have the feeling that I was touching the stairs. I felt so light.
Dass ich die Stufen berühre. Es war so leicht. Unten hat mir beide
Down below, he took both my hands and said, Nurse Maria, today I'm giving you a lot to take along with you.
Und ich habe ihm dafür gedankt.
And I thanked him for that. I felt so very happy. And I went to the hospital at once, and to the ward where I had my duty.
Und da kommt mir eine Patientin entgegen.
Then a patient came towards me, and I took both her hands, and she said, My God, I'm so happy. My God, I'm so happy now. She was to be operated on the next day, and I was supposed to prepare her for the operation.
Und da war sie hat nur
Sie hat immer nur...
She just kept repeating, "I'm so happy."
Dann habe ich gesagt, gehen Sie hinüber zum Oberarzt und sagen Sie
And
ihm...
then I said, "Go over to the doctor and tell him, ask him to examine you once again before the operation."
Der Oberarzt hat es gemacht.
And the doctor did it and fetched the head physician. And the next day, she was able to go home well. There was no longer any sign of the tumor she had had.
A further sign that Gröning doesn't use hypnosis is his effect on animals.
Ich hatte einen Pudel und der hieß Baby.
I had a poodle, and he was called Baby, and he was so very sick. And then we consulted various veterinarians, and they couldn't help him. Then acquaintances of ours said I should call Gröning, that he would help. So that's what I did.
Das habe ich dann auch gemacht. Und hat mir am Telefon gesagt, dann Sie haben...
And he said to me on the telephone, "You have the receiver in your left hand." And it was, too. And when you put the receiver down, stroke your dog from head to tail 3 times, and he will be healed.
3-mal runter und wird gesund werden. Wird zuerst noch viel brechen und Durchfall bekommen.
He will first have to vomit and have diarrhea and be very weak, but he will get well. That's what he said. And that's what happened. And he lived for a long time. He had had canine typhus. Back then there was no cure for it. But Gröning healed him.
Es hat noch kein Mittel gegeben dagegen, ne? Aber der Gröning hat ihn eben geheilt.
Bruno Gröning has a close relationship with animals and all of nature. He says,
Man has gone so far with his skill, with his knowledge and ability, that he's actually in a position to destroy everything natural. Anyone who thinks he can withdraw from the nature that God has so beautifully created for us here should go wherever he wants. That's where the error is. That's where it all is. That's what's missing in man, nature. Back to nature, back to our God and a belief in the goodness of man. We human beings are nothing without our Lord God. We are and remain, all of us, children of God. The only Father we have is our Lord God.